Hey guys, welcome to A Little Bit of Monica. Today we are going to be doing another book to movie adaptation comparison. I am very excited to be doing this one. First of all, I just love doing these comparisons because one, I love reading, obviously, but I also love watching movies, and getting to compare a book to movie or even a movie to book, I feel like is just so much fun. Getting to look at the details, getting to see how I feel during each thing. It's just such a fun time, and I'm excited to be able to share it with you. Today we are going to be talking about It by Stephen King. Now, this book I read back in October with my Stephen King book club over on Discord. This was the book for the Halloween season because everything takes place around Halloween. It was the perfect time, and so we all read the book together, and then once everyone was done reading, we ended up watching the movies together as well. So we started off by doing the 1990 TV movie, and then we went to the 2017 and 2019 remakes, and it was such a fun time getting to talk to everybody and share our thoughts. And so I'm excited to share some of my findings about the book and then the movies and kind of put it all together for you. So we are going to start by talking about the book. So this book is over 1,000 pages, and if you ask me, I think it's a little bit too long. I gave this book 3 stars. It could have been 4, but there was one scene in particular that just ruined it for me, so I ended up knocking it down to 3 stars. Overall, I think this is a really fun, dark, exciting kind of horror. It's very classic Stephen King. This book came out in 1980, and I think it does stand the test of time. Now, there are some concepts in here that I think probably wouldn't be written if they were written today, but I overall really liked the story, and despite it being over 1,000 pages, this thing is a literal brick, I do think that most of the story carries itself, and it is very entertaining throughout the entire book. Let's start off by going through some of the nitty-gritty, the details of this book. I do want to talk about 3 main pieces of the story. First, I want to talk about the timeline. Second, I want to talk about the characters and basically the depth that King goes into with everything in the story. And then finally, I want to talk about the suspense. So starting off with the timeline of the story, the way this is set up is that it is taking place in 2 different timelines. The first one being when the main cast of characters are children. They're like 10 to 12 years old. They are kids growing up in Derry, Maine. Then the second timeline is those same kids, but as adults. So basically in the child's timeline, they are going to face it and defeat it, or so they think, but afterwards they make a pact that if they didn't in fact defeat it once and for all, and it comes back, they are going to reunite later down the road, and they're going to come back to fight it as adults. And that's exactly what happens. So following these 2 timelines, I think is very clever. First of all, I think that Stephen King wrote it impeccably. The way that he was able to kind of merge the timelines within the story, making it feel like a very natural transition, but also making it very clear what timeline we're in at any given moment. I've read books where it's impossible to tell where you are unless you're using very specific details of like context clues. And with this book, I do feel like it is very easy to tell which timeline you're in. One, it's either children or adults. And I think that that's a very different dynamic. You're able to tell pretty quickly if they are talking like children or if they are talking like adults. But also he just labels it really well. So it's clear to tell exactly where you are in the story. And that I think is very, very helpful, especially with a book this dang long. But the timeline I think is really fun because they are overlapping. So we're reading them both at the same time, and that means that when the kids and the adults are both fighting the exact same villain, the same evil force, because they're defeating them in both timelines at the end of the book, it means that you spend the entire book not really knowing what they're going to have to face at the end. And I think that is such an integral part of the suspense and the intensity of this book. Yes, you definitely get an idea as you go, as they are facing off against it on repeated occasions throughout the book. You're getting those little hints at what they're going to be up against, but until they are facing it at the end and understanding exactly what it means to be defeating it, whether it's as children and it comes back or as adults, you don't really understand that until you get to the end of the book. And I think that's a really clever way of writing it, especially because he wrote it so smoothly. I think it just worked really, really well. Now, this timeline also works because it means that we get a very, very deep dive into these characters and exactly who they are and what they are standing for. So as children, we are going to meet them and understand them with their kids' personalities. They are being very dynamic. They are having a little bit of kid drama, but they also are dealing with the bullies at school. They're having things that children would be experiencing, and I really appreciate that. So we're seeing them on multiple levels from there, but then as adults, we are seeing them handling adult issues, and they are trying to grapple with the balance there. And I think that that's really cool that we get to see the depth in their characters as they are children and adults. But in general, I think Stephen King excels at depth of character character and setting and just being able to take something and expand it so much, and it just makes it feel more real. And that's exactly what happens in this book. Not just the main cast of characters that are the kids that turn into adults, but the side characters, the people that you end up hating, which is pretty much everybody in this book, but the characters that are the ones that you love to hate because they are so terrible. Like, they're written so well that they're terrible, and they have such a depth to them that you hate them through and through. And I think that is a really special feeling to be able to have while you're reading, where you hate someone so vividly. It's exactly what happens in this book with a lot of the characters, and I think that that is so much fun to read. I think this also lends itself to the plot, because then the things that these characters are doing, you understand where the depth comes from. Not that you necessarily know why they're doing the things they're doing, but it feeds into that story and helps you understand the plot a lot more. So I really like the depth that he goes into, but not just in the characters, also in the town, the setting that they are in Derry, Maine. One of the things that is special about this book and the way it's set up, it's broken into 6 parts, and in between each part is an interlude that talks about Derry as almost like it's its own person, its own character, because Derry has a history that you begin to understand as different events are uncovered from its past. And I think that these interludes are a really, really clever way of making the history sound a little bit more interesting. Instead of it just being like somebody reading from a history book being like, oh look, this is what happens, you are unveiling it in a really clever way that makes it fun to read, and honestly very, I don't want to say easy to understand, because a lot of this book is like, it can go over your head pretty easily. There's a lot to try to dig into, but I do think that the interlude and that as a concept actually does make this a lot easier to swallow. So I really liked that kind of a setup, and I think that this also leads into the suspense element that I want to talk about, which is the third piece that I think is important to touch on with this book: the suspense and the mystery and the intensity of everything. There is so much tension in this book. There is so much suspense because you never really know exactly what's going on, because the whole concept of it being this cosmic kind of evil force, this villain that they are up against, it really is cosmic to the point where like there's a reason you're not really supposed to understand everything about it, and I really, really appreciate that. And I think the suspense builds really well through this book, especially because I think that every single chapter of this book, and there's a lot of them, it's a long book like I mentioned, but I think that every single chapter of this book feels urgent. Everything that you are reading as you're going, even when it feels repetitive in the middle, because I do think the middle section feels very repetitive and it can feel like it drags on a lot, but even so, during those points, I feel like I was still learning things. I was still learning to understand really crucial elements of the story that ended up helping me appreciate details later on down the road. So I think every single chapter of this book feels important, and I think that's hard to accomplish in a book. It is so easy to find chapters that feel like filler. They feel like things don't really need to be happening, and I think with this book, even if it felt like filler, it still felt like it was helping you understand a concept of the evil force that was at play in this book, and that is just an impressive thing, and it's something I'm impressed with Stephen King's writing in general, but especially in this book, given how long it is. I think it was just written very well, and I'm glad that I read it. The only thing that really stood in my way was the one scene, and this is near the end, and if you've read this book, you're probably going to know immediately what I'm talking about. If you read this book with me, then you definitely know what I'm about to talk about, but I can't not talk about it because the scene really ruined things for me, and I'm still annoyed that Stephen King wrote this in the first place, and it is the scene that takes place right after the kids' timeline when they defeat Pennywise as children. Now, I just don't even understand. I can't even begin to fathom why this needed to be written in the way that it was, but I'm just gonna go right into it. Right after they finish defeating it, they're trying to get out. They're in the sewers, first of all. Great place to defeat the cosmic evil, right? They're in the sewers, they're trying to get out. They realize they don't know the path out. There's too many tunnels. Oh, what's gonna save us? I think that the only way that we're going to be able to get out is if we all bang each other so that we have this flesh-to-flesh connection that will keep us together and help us build this bond that is unbreakable. They are 10 to 12-year-olds banging each other in the sewers, but here's the thing. They are children who don't understand what sex is. They don't understand it. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it. They are in pain. They are uncomfortable. I was in pain and uncomfortable while reading it. Like, the actual discomfort I felt. I was listening to the audiobook and reading this physically, and it was so uncomfortable to have to read. Truly, it was a terrible chapter. I absolutely hated reading that section because the whole point was they were supposed to feel this like connection to each other. Like, that was supposed to be the tie that keeps them together so that when they are adults, they can come back and fight it again, I guess. Like that, I get it. I get that they want to have this deep friendship love, this unbreakable connection, but I think he could have accomplished that with so many other things that didn't include 10 to 12-year-olds banging each other in the sewers. Like, I'm sorry, it was just terrible. It was painful to read, to experience. I hated it. I don't know why it was necessary, and I thank every single force in the world that it was not included in the movie versions, because I simply could not watch it. I couldn't do it. It was terrible to read. So that was the scene that like wrecked the reading experience, and why it got 3 stars instead of 4, which it definitely could have earned had that scene not been in it. But I don't want to talk about that anymore. What I want to do is I want to go into the movies. I want to talk about the movies and how they compared, 1, to the book, and 2, to each other. Because we have not only the 1990 Tim Curry's Pennywise version that actually premiered on 2 different nights on TV, because it was a made-for-TV movie, but they split it in half because of how long it was and also probably the content. But then we also have the 2017 and 2019 remakes. And just to give you a little bit of a spoiler, I loved all 3 of these experiences. I love all of these movies. I think that together they make like the perfect adaptation, and they each have some very, very strong suits. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on each of these movies just to highlight some of the things I loved especially about them, or things that could have been improved just a little bit. Starting off with the original 1990 version, Tim Curry, first of all, let's just applaud the Pennywise that he is. So creepy, so disturbing, and it's in such a human way, because obviously when this was made there were less effects. These newer ones are going to have way more effects that I can talk about, and ways that they can kind of morph Pennywise into more disturbing things. This one was very human because they didn't have as many effects to play with. But I think the creepy, the dark, the twisted vibe was so there, and I absolutely loved it. One of the things that I want to talk about for this movie and with the other one as well is the fact that the casting felt so good. I feel like every single character felt like they were the right person. Every character felt true to the book. I feel like all the characters were very well aligned, and the acting was honestly very good. I want to say, you know, some of the people from the original, they weren't necessarily the world's best actors. However, I do think that they portrayed the parts pretty dang well, and I am very impressed, especially our main character, Bill. He is very central to the story, and we see his young version, Jonathan Brandis, who, if you watched my never-ending story book to movie adaptation video, then you will know that Jonathan Brandis was the main character in the Neverending Story 2, which I hated. I hated that movie, but I really loved him in this. I thought he did a really great job of representing Bill, and the adult version, Richard Thomas, who a lot of people know him because he was in The Waltons, and I loved his portrayal of Bill as well. I think it was very close to what I imagined in the book as well. So I think the acting, the casting choices, all of that was also really good, other than the fact that some of it's just a little bit more dated. So we have more advancements in even acting technique that I think have been implemented in some of the newer stuff, but I think this one is very, very solid. And especially, just to mention again for Tim Curry, he is so deeply disturbing in this. I will simply never get over how disturbing he is in this movie. And just in general, I think Tim Curry plays a bad guy so well. Now, one of the features of this movie as far as the story goes, I think that this one aligns really, really well with the book in the way that it does the timeline, because in this movie we are getting both the children's and the adults' timelines interwoven. We are getting them back and forth. They are portrayed more as like memories. So the adult version is kind of the main timeline, and we're getting the memories of them as children. And I think this is a really clever way of shortening the book, but still keeping all of the main elements there and keeping the timeline as true to what it was in the book. I think this was done really well, and again, it builds that suspense by the end of the movie because the kids and the adults are fighting Pennywise kind of at the same time and trying to figure out exactly what they're up against. I just think that this is done really, really well, but the remakes are going to take a twist on this. So I appreciate that the timeline is maintained in this specific movie. But then the one other thing that I want to touch on that I absolutely love about this movie that makes me really, really sad that the remakes did not include it, and I simply can't talk about this movie without mentioning the fact that this movie maintains so many of the repetitive quotes of the book. I feel like there's a saying that's like, if something is repeated a number of times, it's probably because it's important. Well, in this book, there are a number of phrases that are repeated all throughout the book, and this movie keeps those quotes in here and alive. And honestly, when we were watching this movie, we were having a great time with it because it just is a way of connecting a little bit, but you know the lines already because you've read them multiple times in the book. One of the movies is Bill as he was learning to overcome his stutter. The phrase that he ended up saying all the time was he thrusts his fists against the posts and still insists he sees the ghost. The fact that I can still remember that tells you how many times I had to read it, and he does in fact repeat that line in this movie at least a couple of times. One of the other things that stood out a lot was the "Hi-yo silver away" every time that Bill got on his bike. He loved that bike, and as a kid, kids just say things because they want to, and as a kid, every time he got on his bike, he would say, "Hi-yo silver away," and then he would ride off on his bike. As an adult, he goes back and he finds that same bike, and when he gets on, he says the phrase at least like once or twice, not every single time he wrote it, but he definitely said it at least a couple of times. And it just like fills that little nostalgic piece in you that's like, yes, the callback to the book. But the one that I absolutely missed the most out of the remakes when they didn't include it was every time, especially Richie, every time he would say something inappropriate that people wanted to call him out on and just wanted him to shut up because he was talking about things that didn't need to be said. Every time they wanted to interrupt him or get him to shut up, they would just say, "Beep beep Richie. Beep beep." And it was used so many times in the book to the point where it's like, this could be annoying, but I found it endearing and I loved it. I loved that they all adopted it, even though the friend group starts as like just a couple of them and it grows until there's like 6 or 7 of the kids. And as each kid adds onto the group, they adopt the beep beep terminology so fast. And it just is this like bonding moment, I feel like, when they all adopt this phrase to get each other to shut up if they're talking too much. And I loved it. And it was included in this movie, which made me really, really happy. I am sad to report that the beep beeps were not included in the remakes. I think they said it like once or twice, maybe. I was sorely disappointed to find that out, as well as the "Hi-yo silver away," the "he thrusts his fists," you know, all of those phrases, they were included very, 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 very briefly in here, but not nearly as many times as I would have hoped, considering the fact that they were included in like not every single chapter, but truly they were in almost every single chapter of the book. And I just think that it would have been really cool to have those in these movies. But these movies have a lot of other strong features that I want to talk about really quick. So first of all, these movies are broken up into two. We have It from 2017 and It Chapter 2 from 2019. And the way these are broken up is going to be very different from the timeline of the book and the timeline of the 1990 movie, because this one, the kids are the feature in the first one. Only the kids, it's their timeline, it's their story, it is their original interaction with Pennywise. But It Chapter 2 is the sequel movie, and this one is going to follow the adults timeline, but still has like flashbacks to when they were kids, which does include additional scenes from the actors that portrayed the kids and doing some new scenes to kind of continue to expand the story. But this one is going to really focus more on the adult timeline, which I really like the way this is broken up. I think it does add a little bit of a difference to understanding the true breadth of like what it is capable of, where it comes from. We get a lot more expansion because it is split into those timelines, and we're seeing the perspective is very, very different when they are children versus when they are adults. But speaking of the children versus the adults, I mentioned it with the original movie as the fact that the casting was just so good, and I think the casting in these was almost even more perfect. I could not have picked better people to represent the characters in the story, especially because the kids were obviously done first because they had the first movie. When they cast the adults that would play the older versions of the kids, like the casting was impeccable. I mean, seriously, no notes. I absolutely am obsessed with some of the matchings here. Finn Wolfhard with Bill Hader could not have been a better match. Sophia Lillis with Jessica Chastain, like seriously, so good. The matchings were so incredible. And I think that these actors are just incredible. They are very, very talented and they play the characters very true. So I think the characterization is pretty stable throughout both versions of these movies, but I especially love it in the remakes. I just think that these characters were done so well. And speaking of casting, I cannot talk about these movies without talking about Bill Skarsgård and his portrayal of Pennywise, because he is truly one of the creepiest people I've ever seen in my entire life when he is in this part. I know he is probably a genuinely very nice man, but the way that he plays Pennywise makes me concerned in a lot of ways. It is so creepy, so disturbing, and I love it. He does it so well. It's almost like, other than Tim Curry already doing it super well, I like can't imagine other people doing it the way that Bill Skarsgård pulled off the Pennywise. It was just brilliant in every single manner of the word. A couple of other elements I just want to touch on for these movies. I think that I remember it better. I think that it was done a little bit more memorable in these movies when we learn about the history of it, the history of Derry, and where it comes from, and how it is functioning in Derry as a location, and just how all of that works. I think it was done in a way that makes me remember it a lot better in these movies in particular. And some of that may have to do with the technological advances we've had since the original one was made. The fact that there is more effects, there is more that they were able to do because of the technology we have. So I think that also feeds into the other element of suspense. I think this set of movies has a lot more jump scare, kind of like individual scene creepiness, and trying to get you to feel the eerie, feel the like really weird, twisty types of things that they're able to conjure because they have the effects to do so. And those effects just weren't possible when they made the original movie, or if they were possible, it was very few and far between because it would cost Georgie's arm and a leg to do it. So, I mean, I just feel like these movies go into a little bit more of the larger scale scare tactics and the jump scares, and that just makes sense. But it is something to be excited about for these movies. I genuinely do think that all three of these movies are an excellent portrayal of the story, and I think that they do a really great job of cutting out some of the extra stuff from the book because, again, the book is so freaking long. I think it cuts out the stuff that you don't necessarily need to know, but it keeps all of the really important stuff, gives you a really creepy time, a really creepy experience, while still giving you the suspenseful and the cosmic kind of idea behind what it is. And the book can obviously go into more detail because it has a lot more space to do so, a lot more pages to do so, but I think these movies are a great portrayal, and I truly think that if these were all like captured into one movie, it would be the perfect adaptation. But even so, individually, I think all of them are very, very strong on their own. And I honestly think that that's just really impressive. It's hard to make a good adaptation sometimes because you want to balance the details of the book, but not going into too much detail that then the movie feels bogged down. And I think that these ones did a really, really great job. I think if I had to choose, I would stick with just watching the movies. I don't think I have plans on rereading this book anytime soon or ever. And if I do, I will definitely be skipping that one scene, that's for sure. But in general, I am glad I read the book. I'm glad that I have the full experience, and there are certainly pieces that I think were really fun to have from the book, but I also do feel like the movies do a really great job of portraying it. So if you don't feel like reading the book, you should be just fine watching the movies. But if you do love reading, you are a Stephen King fanatic, you want to read the books, you just love reading more than watching movies, definitely pick this up. Just know it's going to be really disturbing. There are multiple levels of horror, and I just think that in general, Stephen King, he has made it as far as he has because he knows what he's doing, and it's very impressive. So that brings me to the end of my It discussion, but I will have some more Stephen King stuff coming up because of my book club where we have a different book every single month, and so many of Stephen King's books have been adapted at this point that there is going to be plenty more material for me to talk about these comparisons from the book to the TV shows or movies, whatever's been adapted. I will definitely be talking about those more down the road. So you can definitely be, keeping an eye out for those as they come. But in general, I do plan to be doing more of these book to movie adaptations because they are really fun. I love getting to dive into it and to get to talk about two things in my life that I've always really, really loved. So if you have recommendations of books that have been adapted to TV shows or movies that you think I should check out, please let me know in the comments. I would love to consider some new options. I have some other things in the back of my mind that I'm planning for the new year, but I definitely am open to more suggestions. If you like this video and you want to hear more from me, or you want to keep up with these book to movie adaptations, make sure that you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on anything coming up. I want to thank you so much for watching this video, for supporting me. I really appreciate every single second that you spend here and every comment that you leave. I would love to hear from you if you have thoughts, opinions on these as well, or anything that you'd like to share with me. Please leave it in the comments. If you want to join my Stephen King book club, the link is in the description to the Discord there, where we pick a book every single month to read. But with all of that said, I want to thank you again for watching this video, and I hope that I will see you in the next one. Bye!